that their way of life was under attack, and it launched the career of Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy made headlines when he announced in a 1950 speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, that he knew 205 communists were currently working in the State Department. And capitalizing on people's fear of encroaching communism, McCarthy launched a public campaign aimed at eliminating the supposed communist infiltration of government and foreign policy. So his pronouncements catapulted him to national prominence, and he became the chair of the Senate Permanent Investigations Subcommittee. McCarthy took it upon himself to expose communists and their sympathizers not only in government, but also throughout American political and cultural life. So McCarthy's accusations were often unsubstantiated, but in a political and cultural climate filled with fear that gave him considerable power. And hiding behind the veil of national security, McCarthy and his staff refused to reveal their sources of information at a time when simply being called before his committee could ruin an individual's career. So fearful of being named communist sympathizers themselves, many leaders of labor unions and professional organizations joined in the Red Scare hysteria of the early 1950s. And it is within this hysteria that, again, labor unions reacted. And some intellectuals and advocates refused to answer his questions or appear before his committee despite the threat to their personal well-being and the threat of deportation. Several famous Hollywood producers and script writers were among the best-known citizens blacklisted by their employers for refusing to cooperate with the committee. So McCarthy's accusation in 1953 that the military was harboring communists ultimately led to his downfall. In fact, it was Edward Murrow who successfully exposed his tactics and publicly denounced his actions as a threat to America's core democratic values. We will visit Edward Murrow. He will become a very important personage in the plight of undocumented and farm labor groups. Now, the fear of communism significantly affected American domestic policy regarding both immigration policy and workers' rights. In the 1920s, the United States experienced its first Red Scare soon after Russia's Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 that had brought communism to the forefront of people's minds. Well, in the 1950s, the U.S. is going to experience a similar wave of anti-communist fear during the first phases of the Cold War. Overall, this anti-communist fear led to both social and economic policies, and it impacted immigration policy. Now, the first Red Scare was a political and social response to real and imagined fears about leftist and anarchist forces in the United States after the Russian Revolution. J. Edgar Hoover was put in charge of a new branch of the Bureau of Investigation to specifically investigate radical groups. So the first Red Scare, as we understood in this class for the white beans, targeted leftists in general and included non-radical and non-violent socialists. Now, though socialism was a major force in American politics, its similarities to communism led many to fear socialist activity after 1917. Workers' strikes were now interpreted as attempts to lead the U.S. to communism, and socialist leaders, such as former presidential candidate Eugene Debs, was jailed under the Espionage Act, and in Debs' case for a speech that called for resistance to World War I draft. Now, the most significant reaction to the Red Scare, however, was immigration policy. It was fear that the influx of these radicals and anarchists, that the U.S. is going to pass the immigration restriction legislation of the 1920s, especially the Immigration Quota Act of 1924. So when we take a look at the 1950s, the U.S. is going to experience the second Red Scare during the Cold War after Senator Joseph McCarthy began using anti-communist rhetoric to accuse his political opponents of treason. So J. Edgar Hoover now is still director of the FBI. He's going to use his bureau to help investigate communist threats. And ultimately, many people are going to lose their jobs after being wrongfully accused of communism, and many, including a considerable number of Hollywood actors and writers, are going to be put on blacklists. So while McCarthyism declined after a public and judicial backlash in the late 1950s, anti-communist fears remained prevalent across the U.S. McCarthyism, let me just share with you, McCarthyism is the practice of making accusations of disloyalty, subversion, or treason without proper regard for evidence. Again, McCarthyism is the practice of making accusations of disloyalty, subversion, or treason without proper regard for evidence. So since 9/11, we are amid a resurgent McCarthyism. Now, amid this Cold War hysteria, Congress passed very controversial bills regarding immigration restriction in the United States. We've already covered the first bill, which was the 1950 Internal Security Act, but then there's two other bills that were attached to this act, and that was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 and the Subversive Activities Control Act of 1952. Now, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 was sponsored by Senator Pat McCarran. It's usually called the McCarran Act, and required communist organizations and people suspected of communist organization affiliations to register with the U.S. Attorney General. Now, this legislature unfairly targeted Asians and created largely symbolic opportunities. Any immigrant identified as a communist could never achieve citizenship and could be detained without any burden of proof. Now, the United States had quotas of how many people would be allowed in the country, especially those from communist regimes. So the government was afraid that they would spread communist and subversive thought and destabilize the country. So the multiple laws which governed immigration and naturalization at that time are going to be brought under one comprehensive quota system. So it's going to, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, along with Subversive Activities Control Act of 1952, are going to reaffirm the 1924 National Origins Quota System. It limited immigration from Eastern Europe, while it allowed Western Europeans to come in. Again, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are allowed entry into the United States. Now, the Subversive Activities Control Act, along with the Immigration and Nationality Act, reflected the Cold War atmosphere and anti-communism of the period following World War II and at the onset of the Korean War. The law reinforced the Smith Act of 1940 and, coupled with the Immigration and Nationality Act, enforced the continuation of the national origins quota system. So President Truman, who vetoed the acts, was outdone. And in his words, he told Congress that today we are protecting ourselves as we were in 1924 against being flooded by immigrants from Eastern Europe. This is fantastic. We do not need to be protected against immigrants from these countries. On the contrary, we want to stretch out a helping hand to save those who have managed to flee into Western Europe, to succor those who are brave enough to escape from barbarism, to welcome and restore them against the day when their countries will, as we hope, to be free again. There are only a few examples of this absurdity. The cruelty of carrying over into this year of 1952 the isolationist limitations of our 1924 law. In no other realm of our national life are we so hampered and stultified by the dead hand of the past as we are in this field of immigration. So Truman was talking about, again, the white beans, all right? But at least he was addressing the white beans who were fleeing the Soviet Union and its influence.